Lots of democracies around the world that have been very heavily reliant on US technology are starting to reconsider, with Donald Trump being rather erratic. So people are questioning whether they want to deepen their defence dependence on America. That said, it's very hard to break that. You know, America is the world's leading manufacturer of defence technology, so no matter how much we want to find other suppliers, it's going to be a very long process. But as we're seeing, Australia is looking at buying frigates from Japan or Germany, so we're looking to different suppliers, and as we're seeing, the Canadians looks like they're buying this fantastic Australian product from Australia, which is really an awesome thing for Australian industry. And I think it confirms something that I've been saying for a long time, and that is Australia does have world-leading defence industry, and the Australian government should be buying more of it.
How much of that $6 billion project is likely to find its way to Australia, and which part of the Australian sector will benefit most?
So the core of JORN, so the Jindalee Over-the-Horizon Radar, which is a capability that can see an incredibly long way. So most radars can't look over the horizon, so you're sort of limited to at most, a couple of 100 kilometres. This can look out thousands of kilometres, so it's a fantastic technology, but the core of it is really not the hardware. The hardware is really just a bunch of poles and cables out in the middle of the desert. The core is the software, so the processing power that can take a very, very faint electronic signal that's travelled thousands of kilometres and can process that signal and say, well, that's actually an aircraft 2,000 kilometres away heading in this direction, etc., etc. So it's really the software and the processing power is the core. So there's not really going to be a lot of jobs, I think, here in Australia in terms of building actual hardware. The Canadians will probably do a lot of that themselves. It's going to be the brains behind the system. And that's the valuable part of this. So how many billions of dollars that is, I'm not entirely sure. But it's a good thing for Australia, it's a good thing for Australian industry.
It sounds as though you don't believe it will transform Australia's local defence sector, but how much of a boost has the sector already had as a consequence of the AUKUS agreement?
Well, that's a great question, and unfortunately one that's very hard to answer. So we know that all three governments have boosted AUKUS by saying it's going to really increase the amount of defence export and imports between the countries. Defence Minister Marles has said it's going to lead to a lot of Australian defence exports. It's really hard to point to actual exports at this point in time. So there's been a lot of talk, but it's hard to see the actual results. The irony, to some degree, is that this JORN deal may well actually be the biggest defence export in Australia's history, but it's not going to an AUKUS country. Canada is not yet a member of AUKUS, so there's a certain irony here. And the other big defence export that Australia has achieved recently is selling Boxer armoured vehicles back to Germany. So Rheinmetall, a German company, got a contract to build armoured vehicles here in Australia. Because, as we know, European countries are trying to increase their military capability in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Germans are now going to buy back armoured vehicles built by a German company in Australia. So that's another sort of interesting deal, but that's another big deal, but it's not going to an AUKUS country. So I think the thing we need to remember is that Australian defence industry is really good, and it can sell to a whole range of countries. It's not just limited to the AUKUS countries of the US and the UK.
Marcus, you've recently co-authored a report on defence priorities for the next federal government. Given the shifting geopolitical alliances you've touched on, does it include a recommendation for a significant upgrade in the level of Australian defence spending?
Yes, it does. So
by how much?
So we're currently almost exactly on 2% and have been there for about 6 or 7 years. We're saying we need to get to 3%. And not overnight, but on a pretty rapid trajectory. So certainly to 2.5% in the next 2 or so years, and then on to 3% before the end of the 2030s. Why are we saying that? Well, look, we actually wrote that before Donald Trump was inaugurated for his second term, and I think everything we've said has been reinforced by what we've seen under President Trump Mark II. So there's two ways of looking at this. The first one is we're a good ally of the US. We've depended on the US for our defence. We want the US to stay engaged in the region to help us. But the US is spending between 3 and 3.5% of GDP on defence. Well, it's only fair that if we're relying on US support, that we're paying a similar amount. We should also be paying about 3%. The alternative view is that, well, how dependent do you want to be on the US under President Trump? Will they continue to be a reliable ally? Well, if they're not a reliable ally, we need to be doing a lot more to build our own self-reliance. And of course, that costs money. So whichever way you look at it, we need to be spending more. The only other alternative is that we sort of revert to a kind of barely armed neutrality and we kind of hide in the South Pacific hoping the world passes us by and doesn't take any notice of it. I'm not sure how realistic that approach is. So either way you look at it, we need to be developing our defence capabilities. We need to be spending more here in Australia to develop our own defence industry. And I think, 3%, people used to say 2% was kind of the benchmark for countries that are serious about their defence. That, in the current world, this current unstable, dangerous world, that new benchmark, I think, is becoming 3%.
Marcus Hellyer, thank you for joining the program.
Thank you.